Hi, my name is Alexandra Rügler. I am a comic artist from Berlin, Germany. My mother is from Korea and my father is from Berlin, Germany, and I grew up in Berlin. I lived in Korea for 1 year, a little bit more than a year. I was a exchange student at Seoul and I studied traditional drawing techniques and calligraphy. 안녕하세요. 제 이름은 알렉산드라 르글러이에요. 어머니가 한국 사람이에요. 아버지는 독일 사람이에요. 서울에서 1년 동안 살았어요. 서울대학교에서 국제대학생이었어요. 한국어 공부했어요. 수묵화 공부했어요. 네. To decide whether a story becomes a graphic essay or a short comic, a journalistic comic or something else, I think that's it depends on how much time and space the story needs, like how much the content needs to breathe, and also what kind of feelings are trying to be conveyed. Is it a story that needs to include a lot of facts? Do I want to evoke a certain kind of feeling? Is it a short poetic observation? Then maybe it's more of a graphic essay or like a little comic poetry, graphic poetry. Or when there's more facts, it's a comic journalistic piece. Well, I went to Korea to explore my Korean heritage and also to learn more about the culture, and I studied traditional drawing and calligraphy in university there, and I think a lot of the techniques and traditional approaches of the Korean culture has kind of moved over into what I regard as very important or what influences me a lot. And on the other hand, from German art or art in Germany or Europe, I have learned a very individualistic approach into making art or telling stories, and I think that also has a place there. Apart from the techniques that I've learned from both areas of my life, I think in terms of perspective of storytelling, it's really healthy to have different cultural viewpoints, and so you can learn that maybe there's lots of different ways to tell a story, and maybe there's not one way that works, but maybe there's one way that works for you. Yeah, when I studied in Korea, I studied calligraphy and traditional drawing techniques and painting. There was a lot of repetitious exercises, and it was a big focus on learning how the old masters did it, how to master tradition, and I really quite enjoyed the process of first figuring out how things work before you go and do your own things. And I think in contrast with that, in the European art universities that I've been in, it was more like the expression of the self was first, and then the techniques came much later, or you found a way to work with what you had. There was also, of course, you also learned how to draw and paint and all of these things. You got the basics, but the basics were a little bit shorter, and the self-expression and individualistic focus was stronger and faster. Yeah. I think I realized while working on the book that these questions of belonging or looking for home and have always been part of my life, maybe, before I even realized it. Not quite sure if there's actually a proper answer to it. Maybe it cannot be solved completely, and now I'm at the point where I think that's okay. But it has taken me a long time to get there. Yeah, the conclusion right now, or if there is one, this is actually the realization I am not necessarily one or the other. Sometimes people decide for you, and that sucks a little bit, but it is the way it is. But I can come up for myself with the idea that I'm not necessarily one or the other, but I'm my own new thing, and that's actually great. Maybe, yeah, younger generation can relate with that. Yeah, the sense of belonging, like there's always like a search, maybe for many people. And for me, it's like the realization came while working on this project that maybe I do belong somewhere. It's just that it's the in between, and that's fine. I think when you tell stories about diaspora and migration, it's important to know what the collective memory is or the collective experiences are. I personally choose to tell personal stories because of the relatability. It opens up people to experience and to empathize with the stories. And sometimes it's easier and more accessible to feel or to see what one person has experienced and then to follow their path from there, from the little you understand the big picture. The comic Im Anderswo, it deals with the topics of looking for your identity. It's about looking for a home, searching for belonging in this world. It's about migration and diaspora topics. It's autobiographical too. It shows members of my family who have been in between Korea and Germany for the last 50 years. There's several questions that are covered, like why did they move there at a certain point, and why maybe did they return also. Some of them returned, some of them stayed. And there's a lot of different motivations for that, and I find that very interesting. And the story takes place in Berlin, it takes place in Seoul, in the countryside of Korea, also in the prairie in the Midwest of the US. Mostly the story deals with the question of how do I find a home in today's world. Yeah, I hope if someone looks at my stuff in the future, I hope they have some sense of bonding through the human experience or something. As a child, I was obsessed with Greek mythology. And what I always took from it is that there are certain things that repeat, and no matter the circumstances, or the historic times, people always have challenges, and they move, they migrate, they make mistakes, they fail, they love, they succeed, they overcome. Things like that is what is beautiful to see again and again, no matter the time in art.
Everywhere, but as a child, you're kind of naturally introduced to comics because a lot of things made for children are made in comic form. So I can't really remember when I started reading comics. I didn't really draw that much for pleasure, it was more for communication. I think I have the same relationship to drawing today, but I remember, and I don't know if it's a real memory, but it feels like I can remember a time when it was really hard for me to speak. Probably because I lost my Korean and I was learning Swedish. And I remember saying to my mom that, oh, I want to be able to speak like you. I want to say long sentences. So I got angry and frustrated, and I turned to drawing to communicate. But I have this kind of rootlessness. I also realized that one thing I really enjoy about being abroad is that I get to be a foreigner on my own terms. Because in Sweden, I'm very often treated as a foreigner, even though I'm Swedish. But you can never fully become a Swede if you are, like me, a transracial adoptee, where it's very visible that you are not from that country originally. I feel it's like the opposite, that I blend in very nicely. But as soon as I open my mouth, of course, it's very obvious that I'm not from here. So it's still in both where I was adopted to and where I was born, I always have to explain myself. I had decided I was going to write a book called Palimpsest, and it was going to be about adoption. And I tried to tell a very different story, and it didn't work. My son, my firstborn, when he was about 2, he started asking questions about where we come from, and he was pointing at other Asians, and I realized that I needed to do something about it, because I couldn't just leave him with, oh, it's because I'm adopted, and that's it. That doesn't feel like an answer. That's just, I know it sounds like a cliche, but palimpsest kind of wrote itself in that sense, because the way that it's told is almost exactly the way things unfolded in real life, like a detective story. Yep. The search and the revelation of the fraudulent nature of my adoption and all that, and the realizing that there's been corruption and people selling children here in Korea, all that unfolded exactly the way it's described in palimpsest. And this is just thousands and thousands of mothers in Korea who just abandon their children on like doorsteps. And I was also told that I should consider myself like having been born on the plane from Korea. So the 2 years that I lived in Korea they didn't really matter. And you hear it in culture and TV series, and everybody's adopting, everybody loves adoption. And we never, ever get to hear like the first family side, for instance, because they have a very different story to tell. And of course, the adoptees, we are so, indoctrinated into what we are supposed to say. I usually compare it a bit to like Neo's experience with the Matrix. My adoption activism was born when I discovered that my papers were fraudulent, and I started asking questions. But I think I have an activist personality. I've always been fighting loudly for the rights of LGBTQIA people. I've also been, probably a few years before I started with adoption activism, I did a lot of work with anti-racism. So I've always been like loud and angry about injustices. I must have been in my 30s. I said that I don't want to make political comics, and I don't want to make autobiographical comics, because that's what everybody is doing. And then I made palimpsest, and the response was so massive. And also when I started making comics about anti-racism or racism against Asians, I got so much response from that too. I felt that there's actually a hunger for these comics. So I think activism in comic form was something that people really wanted, and about this subject. Absolutely. Because there's a lot of comics about feminist issues, and about abuse, and about refugees, and about different wars and areas that are in conflict and stuff. But very few, but growing as well, about adoption. Yeah. And Asians. So I felt like there was a gap to fill there, and I feel quite comfortable being there. Yeah.
And how do you plan?
안녕하세요. 프랑스 앙굴렘에 살면서 만화 그리는 문정인이라고 합니다. 이번 페스티벌에는 제가 그린 첫 만화책 긴 숨으로 참여하게 되었습니다. 저는 예전부터 컬러 그림보다 흑백 그림에 더 매력을 느껴왔어요. 저한테 컬러는 조금 시끄럽다고 느껴지거든요. 그래서 저는 흑백 그림의 고요함이 좋은 것 같아요. 뭉크의 판화 작업과 에드워드 고리의 흑백 일러스트레이션 작업들을 많이 보고 따라 그리면서 공부를 했어요. 그러다 보니까 자연스럽게 펜과 잉크를 사용해서 그리게 된 것 같습니다. 그리고 저는 그림이 둔탁해지는 걸 잘 참지 못하는 스타일이라 펜촉이 조금이라도 벌어져서 선이 굵어진다 싶으면 바로 새 펜촉으로 바꾸거든요. 거의 원고 한 장에 펜촉 한 개씩을 쓰면서 작업했던 것 같습니다. 저는 개인적으로 어렸을 때 좀 오랫동안 글을 썼었고 또 소설가를 꿈꾸기도 했어서 저에게 그림은 이야기를 전달하는 통로이자 수단이기에 그림을 그리려면 항상 이야기가 필요하고 단어 혹은 문장 혹은 하고 싶은 말이 필요한 것 같아요. 저는 예전부터 어디서든 잘 소속감을 느끼지 못했던 사람인 것 같아요. 16살 때 프랑스 고등학교에 가게 되면서 학교에 동양인도 많지 않았고 한국 문화가 잘 알려지지도 않은 시점이라 인종차별도 훨씬 심했고 가서 많이 외로웠거든요. 이 서양 중심의 사회에서 나는 누구이고 이곳에서 나의 정체성은 어떻게 다루어지고 나는 어디로 가서 살아야 하나 라는 질문들을 치열하게 하기 시작했던 것 같아요. 그 질문들이 지금까지 제가 하고 있는 작업의 토대가 되는 것 같습니다. 저와 같은 상황에 있거나 같은 것을 느끼는 사람들에게 뭔가 위로가 되면 좋겠다. 그 사람들이 조금 더 살아볼 수 있는 힘과 용기가 조금이나마 되면 좋겠다라는 생각으로 작업하고 있습니다. 시스터 아웃사이더는 2023년에 더 많은 한국 여성들끼리 연대하고 의지하고 서로 힘을 모았으면 좋겠다는 마음에서 시작을 하게 됐어요. 매주 화요일마다 모여서 각자 분야의 지식을 공유하는 스터디 모임도 있고요. 또 함께 전시를 기획하고 공모하는 모임도 있어서 현재 파리에서 단체전을 진행하고 있기도 해요. 모두가 공감할 수 있는 유럽살이나 예술가의 머니잡 같은 주제로 수다회를 열기도 하고 기회가 될 때는 오프라인 모임이나 워크숍도 열고 있습니다. 나와 같은 상황에 놓인 사람들로 이루어진 커뮤니티가 있다는 게 제일 큰 의지가 되는 것 같아요. 작업적으로도 그렇고 내가 구구절절 설명하지 않아도 알아들을 수 있는 사람들이 곁에 있다는 것 자체가 이미 너무 큰 의지가 되고요. 또 이 콜렉티브에 계신 분들이 좀 다양한 분야에 계시다 보니까 일러스트 만화만 공부를 하면 알기 힘든 재밌는 레퍼런스를 쉽게 많이 알 수 있기도 해요. 사실 이 작업을 기획한 건 되게 오래 전이었어요. 어렸을 때부터 엄마가 해주는 엄마 어렸을 때 이야기를 들으면서 너무 재미있어서 나중에 이걸로 뭐라도 만들어야겠다고 쭉 생각을 해왔었거든요. 한국에서의 삶을 거리를 두고 보게 되면서 이 할머니의 삶이 얼마나 독특하고 소중하고 이 들려줄 만한 가치가 있는 것인지 더 느끼게 되었던 것 같아요. 그래서 2020년부터 여름에 할머니 집에 갈 때마다 할머니한테 살아온 삶의 이야기들을 물어보면서 그냥 무작정 녹음을 하기 시작했어요. 만화를 그리게 되기 시작하면서 장편 만화로 만들어야겠다고 결심을 하게 되었고요. 무엇보다 이 앙골렘 레지던시가 편안하고 좀 안전하게 느낄 수 있는 환경을 만들어준 것 같은데요. 그 환경에 있는 것 자체만으로도 그림을 그리고 싶어지게 만들더라고요. 프랑스의 만화 일러스트계가 다양성이 그리 두드러지지 않다 보니까 어디서든 홀로 동양 여성인 경우가 많았고 그래서 자주 조금 외롭다고 느껴왔었거든요. 그런데 이렇게 정말 외국인 친구들이 가득한 환경에 있다 보니까 훨씬 안전하고 편안하다고 느꼈고 이런 즐거운 마음으로 내 원고를 마무리할 수 있었습니다. 우선 첫 만화책이다 보니 이게 책으로 나온다는 것 자체가 믿기지가 않고요. 제가 정말 오래전부터 꼭 들려주고 싶었던 이 이야기를 꺼낼 수 있어서 너무 뿌듯하고 감사하고 감격스러운 마음입니다. 할머니를 인터뷰를 하면서 사실 할머니께서 여러 번 자기는 살아오면서 마음에 쌓인 게 많아서 가끔 그냥 글로 모든 것을 막 적어버리고 싶을 때가 있다라고 말씀을 하셨어요. 그때마다 제가 어떤 형태가 될지도 모르는 채로 그냥 할머니 그 얘기 내가 다 꺼내주겠다고, 내가 다 해줄게 라고 이야기를 했었거든요. 그 약속을 지킬 수 있는 것 같아서 너무 기쁩니다. 제가 할머니를 인터뷰하면서 삶에 대한 질문을 할 때마다 할머니가 이런 걸 누가 궁금해 하느냐고, 아무도 나한테 이런 걸 물어본 사람이 없었다, 너한테 처음 얘기하는 거다 라고 들려준 얘기들이 정말 많았거든요. 그래서 이 책을 세상 밖으로 꺼내 놓으면서 할머니 이야기를 궁금해 하는 사람이 이렇게 많고 할머니의 삶과 이야기가 이만큼 들려줄 가치가 있는 것들이다 라는 이야기를 전해드리고 싶어요. 그리고 2020년부터 녹음을 하기 시작했다고 말씀을 드렸는데요. 지금 2026년이니까 정말 오래 걸려서 세상에 나오게 된 프로젝트라서 작업을 할 때는 이걸 내가 정말 끝낼 수 있을까 회의감이 들 때도 있었는데 드디어 이 이야기를 사람들과 나눌 수 있게 돼서 너무 감사하고 기쁜 마음입니다. 차기작은 비슷한 이야기를 할 것 같아요. 외로운 사람들에게 조금만 더 살아보자, 이런 것은 어떨까라는 하나의 제안을 하는 이야기가 될 것 같고요. 저는 모든 이야기는 일종의 자서전이라고 생각을 하긴 하지만 그래도 이번 이야기보다는 훨씬 픽션적인 부분이 많은 그런 이야기가 될 것 같습니다.
여자잖아 우리 어머 어떤 날에 날라 요런 종사 허멍 살게 헤엄신고 여도사나 어느 제라 저리 갖고 용을 해치마 어느 제라 저리 갖고 휘 올 때 기술가 막
Hello, I'm Cherie Domingo. I make comics. I grew up in south of Germany, in Stuttgart, with a Filipino mom and a German dad, and live now in Berlin, and we're here in our beautiful studio. In both my books, fantasy plays a big role. In Long Distance Call or Ferngespräch, there are scenes that are playing in a like a dream-like world. Little girl is making up in the story, and it helps me to show the inner world of the characters, like their emotions. For example, there's this grandma that is not tangible, she's melting, and she's a bit like a ghost appearing in this story. It shows this longing of this girl that she also doesn't know her grandma so well, while she's already disappearing. My first impulse was I wanted to tell a story about the work migration. In the first place was also the characters, like this place of the retirement home, the girl that doesn't know her grandma and is mixing, like it's looking at the old people in the retirement home. Like this feeling was in the first place. When I started working, or later, I realized that it's a political topic. It's about free people and free generations. They all meet in a retirement home and they all have in common that they don't want to be in this place. While the grandmother in the story is dying in the Philippines, she has to take care of the elderly in this home, in this retirement home where she is working, and her daughter is accompanying her. There she meets one of the elderly who's living there and is struggling with aging and the loss of her husband. When I started presenting my book Ferngespräch, I met Patrick at a reading. 2 years later, No, 1 year later, I received an email from Patrick asking me if I want to bring this script that he was writing to life. When I was reading the script, I read this like, oh, okay, it's about a giant monster. And yeah, I really felt the urge to draw this monster. And it was also liberating in a way to work on a topic that I haven't come up with. So it was a nice challenge. It's based on a real story. It's about this actress Choi Eun-hee and Shin Sang-ok, abducted by Kim Jong-il in the 80s, and also the giant monster Pulgasari. So there are two storylines in this book which are reacting to each other. In my stories, I try to combine topics that are quite heavy, like loneliness, aging, work migration, death, with lightness. My goal is to depict the characters in a loving way, show their quirks without making fun of them. I would like people to laugh and cry at the same time when they read my stories. So at the moment I'm working on the second book together with Patrick Speth. It's not a giant monster, but it's also a big animal this time. It's about a whale, a beluga whale getting lost in the Rhine in the 60s. So it's also based on a true story. And I would like the reader to be excited while reading the story. It's a bit of like an adventurous story for the book that I don't know yet what it's gonna be, but that I'm probably gonna write again myself. I would like to make people laugh and cry again.
만화.
Manhwa.
만화. 만화.
만화.
Manhwa.
만화.
만화.
만화. 만화. 화이팅! 됐을까요?
됐습니다.